If you're like me, when you tried to buy the Analog Pocket glow-in-the-dark edition on the Analog website when it launched, you found out the unfortunate truth that all of them sold out in a paltry 2 minutes. For me, it was only the reCAPTCHA that slowed me down from the 2-minute to the 3-minute mark to not be able to purchase the glow-in-the-dark that I had in the cart on the Analog website. All of this got me to thinking, if we can't buy the glow-in-the-dark handheld game system, maybe we can make one. That led me down the path of discovery to learn just how easy it is to transform a Game Boy Color into a full-blown glow-in-the-dark game system. By the way, I'm going to reveal that glow-in-the-dark game system to you by the end of the video, so be sure to stick around so you don't miss it. All of the Game Boy Color items featured in this video are available at RetroGameRepairShop.com and linked for you in the video description. This isn't sponsored content, and I bought everything you see here out of pocket. I just really like Retro Game Repair Shop and the quality of their products. You can use discount code BLAINE at checkout to save 10% on your total purchase. A quick note here about that IPS display. As of version 2.6 of the product, it no longer requires soldering to install. I like this idea because what gets made easy gets done, and it makes this project accessible to a much larger group of gamers. Since the display is now on version 2.7, we're good to go. So I decided to use this Game Boy Color that's already been modded since there's basically not much OEM left to preserve here. But as you'll soon find out, when other people go into a game system before you, sometimes they leave you some special surprises waiting. First step in the process, push in the tab to remove the battery cover and take out the two AA batteries. These Amazon Basics branded batteries and some other Amazon products to help you with the installation process are also linked in the video description. There are 6 tri-wing screws holding the front and the back halves of the Game Boy Color shell together. You'll specifically need a tri-wing style of screwdriver to take these out. Just like some other key installation components you'll need along the journey, I have a tri-wing screwdriver link for you in the video description. These tri-wing screws are different from the inner Phillips head screws, so I recommend that you keep both types of screws separated in a parts tray. With the 6 tri-wing screws removed, separate the 2 halves of the shell by flipping the front part of the shell up and over its top. There's a ribbon at the top of the display that's connected to the motherboard in the back part of the shell, and you don't want to rip it out and risk damaging its socket. Be prepared for the on-off switch and the infrared cover to fall out of the shell when you separate the 2 halves, but don't worry, we'll put them back in the right places in the new shell in just a moment. Remember how I said there might be some surprises along the way during this process? Well, here's one of them. There are supposed to be 3 Phillips head screws connecting the motherboard to the front side of the shell, but in this instance, there's only this one single Phillips head screw. Whether intentionally or accidentally, the 2 Phillips head screws that sit along the sides of the motherboard were not put back in when the case swap was done originally by its previous owner. But don't worry, once we get everything moved over to the new shell, we'll be installing 3 screws through the motherboard. To free the original display from the motherboard, there are 2 latches, or basically like a locking bail, at the top of the socket. Push those 2 latches up and away from the socket toward the top of the motherboard. Then you'll be able to take the ribbon cable and the display and freely remove them from the socket. I love these hard shells the new display ship in. Not only do they protect the new display during transport, but you can put your old display in it to protect it as well. Inside the hard shell case, the display is wrapped in bubble wrap, and then there's this warning card underneath it that's stored in here upside down. Oh wait, maybe I filmed it upside down. Let's take a closer look because it might be important. So yeah, it turns out that card is kind of important. It says to make sure to test the display before you install it into the shell. To do this, insert the ribbon cable into the socket on the motherboard with the ribbon cable shiny pins facing up. Then on that bail lock on the front, take those 2 pins on the side and just push them inward toward the socket to lock the ribbon cable into place. To power on the display to test it for the first time, you'll need to be able to put batteries back in the system. To do this, insert the motherboard into the bottom half of the shell. Then once you have the battery terminals pushed through the bottom part of the shell, you can flip it over and then reinsert the 2 AA batteries, just long enough to be able to test the display and make sure it turns on correctly and has no dead pixels. If you powered off your system at the ON/OFF switch before you disassembled everything, and you probably did and probably should have, locate the small ON/OFF switch on the motherboard, then use a fingernail to reach in and slide the switch from the off to the on position. And sure enough, the display looks great, is vibrant, and has no dead pixels. To continue the installation, you'll need to remove power from the system by removing the 2 AA batteries out of the battery housing at the back shell. Then, just like you did with the old display, you'll need to temporarily remove the new display. Push those bail locks forward at the socket, and then the display and the ribbon cable should slide out with no resistance. Just like that. To install the new display into the front shell, first, peel away the protective coating and set it off to the side. Peel the adhesive strip coverings off the 3 strips on the back, and then insert the display with the bottom going into the front side of the housing first. Make sure you have everything lined up exactly like you want, including tucking in the ribbon cables inside the housing before you press the display down. Once you've pressed the display down, it's meant to stay there for life. With the display secured in the housing, grab the film you previously removed from the front of the display and put it back in place to temporarily protect the front lens. Along with the display and the warning card, there's a FunnyPlaying black piece of film that needs to be applied on the shiny back side of the display. It's meant to protect the display board from shorting out against the back side of the display. Credit where credit's due to Tito over at Macho Nacho Productions for teaching the value of using Kapton tape. It's highly heat resistant, non-conductive, and makes a great insulator when you're putting 2 pieces of electronics this close together. Once you put the motherboard back in the shell, it will be precariously close to shorting out against the driver board for the new display. So insulating and protecting both sides of the driver board is a great idea to help keep things safe inside the shell. While you've got the whole thing open, it makes sense to grab some cotton swabs and isopropyl alcohol to clean the button and D-pad contacts on the motherboard. Just dip the Q-tips in Isopro and give each of the contacts a gentle wipe. And don't forget the 2 on the bottom for the start and select buttons. Once you have all of the motherboard contacts cleaned up, take a moment to grab a Q-tip and some Isopro and clean up the carbon dots in each of the membranes for the D-pad, the A and B buttons, and also the carbon dots and membranes for the start and select buttons. And remember, the membrane serves as both the carbon dot holder and the button for start and select. With the membranes all cleaned up, now you can insert the buttons and the D-pad into the front housing. The D-pad has a specific orientation to go into the housing. Just make sure that all 4 of the directions of the D-pad protrude evenly out of the front shell. Insert the B and A buttons into the shell, making note that they have a singular orientation in which they'll go into the shell to make sure that the letters align correctly when displayed from the front of the system. Then insert the start and select membrane into the bottom center of the front shell, and these can be oriented in either direction. Okay, maybe not vertically, but I'm sure you're tracking. Next up, grab the silicone membrane for the D-pad and pay attention to its orientation. There are 2 posts surrounding the D-pad and 2 holes that correspond to those 2 posts on the silicone membrane. Just be sure to orient the silicone membrane through both of the posts surrounding the D-pad and push it all the way down to secure it in place. When you go to put the silicone membrane in for the A and B buttons, take note that one post is larger than the other and one corresponding hole on the membrane is larger than the other. Be sure to align the membrane to match the small post and the large post and then push it down to secure it in place. To reinstall the display back to the motherboard, push the 2 locking tabs on the bail lock forward. Insert the ribbon cable into the socket with the pins facing up. Once you have the ribbon completely inserted into the socket, push the 2 locking tabs on the bail back toward the socket. This will secure the ribbon down to the socket. Seeing as how the ribbon can easily come out of the socket even with the locks down, I think it makes sense to use a piece of that Kapton tape to just secure the ribbon to the socket with a little bit of additional reinforcement. That way it won't come out and risk damaging either the ribbon or the socket. A quick note about that precariously dangling speaker at the end of the motherboard. You can protect the wires from breaking off of either the motherboard or the speaker by just using a little bit of blue tape or painter's tape to hold everything in place while you're working on the motherboard. As this is obviously a no solder install process, if you happen to break the speaker wires off of either the speaker or the motherboard during this installation process and you don't have a soldering iron, you're in deep trouble. You'll either have to find someone who can solder it back on for you or learn how to solder fast enough to get into the Guinness Book of World Records. Either way, if you just take a moment to gently take some blue tape and secure the speaker and the wires in place while you're working on the motherboard, and then just gently remove that blue tape when you're done, everything should be fine. Place the motherboard back into the front shell. Take the speaker and place it into the designated housing in the front shell. Also be sure to tuck the wires away so they don't get pinched when you put the back shell on. Remember how the motherboard only had one of the 3 screws securing it to the front shell in the original installation? Well, the replacement glow-in-the-dark shell came with additional screws, 3 of which are shorter than the 6 that go on the outer casing. These 3 shorter screws do a great job of securing the motherboard down to the screw post in the new shell. If you remember from earlier, 2 things likely fell out of the shell when you disassembled the original shell. The first one was the button for the ON/OFF switch. The other one was the infrared cover. The button goes in a tract at the edge of the front shell. It also needs to have the two posts that come off of the button meet up with the ONOFF switch on the motherboard itself. Push the button down into the track, aligning the two posts off of the button to the ONOFF switch. You'll know you've got it right when you feel that kind of notch when you push the button up or down to indicate that the system is turned on or turned off. The other piece is the infrared port cover. Orient it with a notch on the cover facing the back of the system and the completely flush part facing the front of the system toward the display. It can be a little bit fidgety to get in, especially when you're trying to do it on camera. But if you just orient it correctly and push it flush down with the top of the system, you'll see that it will line up just as it needs to for the bottom shell to go in place correctly. As you go to install the back of the shell to the front of the shell, make note of the touch sensor. It's this little piece right here, and it kind of looks like the flag on the outside of a mailbox. In this particular installation, rather than taking the touch sensor and shoving it into the front of the shell, it made better sense to take it and roll it into the back area of the shell. Then with the touch sensor in place, you can reunite the two pieces of the shell. Before you button everything up, it's a good idea to test the ONOFF button and the volume dial. And just take a moment to make sure that there are no gaps anywhere between the rear shell and the front shell, and that things like that infrared cover lined up correctly with both halves of the shell. Just like with the removal of the screws from the old shell, there are 6 tri-wing screws to put back into the new shell. You can use the old tri-wing screws from the old one or the new screws supplied with the shell kit. If you're going to put this much new stuff in your Game Boy Color, you might as well treat it to a new pair of AA batteries. Drop them in and secure them in place with the new battery cover. So you've got some leftover Q-tips and that isopropyl alcohol. Use them to clean up the back of the shell before you apply the new decals. This will clean the oils and things from your hands off of the back shell and give the decals a fresh, clean place to stick to. Now you can attach the 4 decals to the back shell. 3 of these are transparent, and the one for the battery cover with the 800-255-3700 phone number is solid. Here's a look at what the 4 stickers will look like once they're applied to the back shell. With everything now assembled, you can adjust the brightness to 8 different levels by tapping the sensor available to you on the back right corner of the shell. It's amazing to see the transformation that this Game Boy Color has gone through. Its beautiful blue color stands out in the daylight. But what about its glow-in-the-dark properties? After all, that's what you've been waiting to see, isn't it? Well, wait no more, because we're about to put the finishing touches on this project with a glow-in-the-dark game cartridge shell from Retro Game Repair Shop with my favorite Game Boy Color game programmed in. Here's the final reveal in 3, 2, 1, go. And here it is, glowing in the dark in its full glory. These images captured with my iPhone 15 Pro Max of it glowing in the dark are just extraordinary. And how about those transparent labels and glow-in-the-dark cartridge shell? They just add to the perfection of the look. Throw in a copy of my game Ravenscore to play on this newly modded Game Boy Color, and the fun just never ends. Grab your free copy of Ravenscore at the link in the description, then learn how to program your own Game Boy games at the video shown on screen or linked in the description.